it's the problem with genre, right? Because genre is a language for us to talk about books to understand one another. And most people who use the term dark fantasy, they're talking about this spectrum between epic fantasy that's kind of has more light elements and has this heroic arc, uh, to grimdark, which is very gritty and has just this rough, tumultuous world and extremely morally gray characters. And so when people say dark, they're like, well, it's not grim dark, but it's dark.
Do you love science fiction and fantasy books? You found yourself in the right dimension. Welcome to the greatest podcast in the multiverse, where each week I talk to science fiction and fantasy authors about myth, magic, and the infinite possibilities of storytelling. I'm your host, Herman Stuernagel, and I'll be taking you on a journey with some of your favorite authors, helping you to get to know them and possibly uncover some new literary gems along the way. Ready to explore? Because on this show, every conversation is a doorway into a different world. So welcome once again to the greatest podcast in the multiverse. I am really excited to have James Dulin here today. Welcome here, James.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited, to be on the greatest podcast in the multiverse is kind of an honor.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. It's an honor to have you here. James, why don't you get us started and let people know who you are and a little bit about your writing journey?
Sure. So, as Herman said, my name is James Dulin, and I came out with my debut novel, No Heart for a Thief, right back here in January of this year, and my next novel, No Safe Haven, which is a direct sequel, comes out October 24th. I'm really excited for that release. I think it's gonna it's gonna really amplify everything that people loved about book one and take it into some fun directions. My book, No Heart for a Thief, is in SPFBO. Hopefully, by the time everything airs with this, it will still be an SPFBO. And so, yeah, just enjoying my time as a debut novelist and talking to some fun people like you.
Awesome. So real quick, just for our listeners who might not know what that big long acronym was that you just spouted off, can you tell us a little bit about that contest?
Yes. So SPFBO, the Self-Published Fantasy Blog Off, is in its 9th year as a competition. It was started by author Mark Lawrence, who you might know from Prince of Thorns, or I think his most recent one was The Book That Wouldn't Burn, which I'm listening to audiobook right now, and it's pretty great.
Cool.
So Mark Lawrence started this competition. 300 books enter, and 10 blogs pick up 30 books apiece. Then about 6 months after the competition gets started, they all pick one of their 30 to send forward as their finalist. And then all 10 blogs read the 10 finalists and pick one winner overall. You have some amazing books that have come from this competition. One of my favorite is Sword of Kaigan, which kind of is one of those self-published books that gets thrown around in a lot of trad spaces because it's so fun and so good. And so it's a fun competition. At the end of the day, it's a really great way to connect with other authors, but it's also a really cool way to connect with readers. So we're in that process of, it's about the last month and a half before people have to announce their finalists. So cuts are starting to happen on a kind of rapid basis right now.
Very cool. Yeah, I just entered myself the SPSFC, which is a science fiction version of that as well with my release Eclipse. So it is a fun process, and there's definitely a lot of hype and a lot of build up with the authors in the contest. So it is pretty cool to get to know some of the other contestants.
Yeah, it's a wild process. It kind of has a life of its own, and it's funny because you have SPF. I always forget the science fiction
it's
one.
I always do too. I think SPSFC.
So you got that one, and then you got the new one that's Sphinx, which is SFINCS or something like that. It's a novella competition.
Yeah.
And they all kind of spun off of this idea that generated from Spiffbo, which is really cool. So you have this
Mm.
small thing that has become such a central part of SFF community, especially in self-published spaces.
Definitely. Yeah. And, as a result of these two competitions, now three competitions, I guess, you definitely get to recognize more authors and more um, books as a result of it. And it
Yeah.
definitely quickly adds to your TBR pile.
The first finalist was announced today, actually, for this year's Spiffbo, and it's a book
Okay.
I don't think anybody had really heard of before. It had 7 ratings on Goodreads,
Oh, wow.
and now that 7 is going to shoot up real quick. It is
Yeah.
the Masters of the Void or something like that. It
Okay.
sounded really cool. It was picked by Covers with Cassidy, the YouTube channel team.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, so it's cool to see a book that hasn't really gotten attention just blow up like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And it just goes to show that there are so many good books out there that just haven't gotten people's attention and just needs to hit the right audience in order to be recognized like that. So
yeah.
that's a really cool outcome of this competition.
I think marketing is a really hard thing for a lot of authors. People don't sit down
Hmm.
to write a book and go like, "Well, what's my business plan?"
Absolutely.
Um, and
Yep.
so some people can gravitate towards that a little bit easier than others, but it's not easy. It's not a transferable skill of creating a
No,
story.
it's
So
not.
I mean, thank you to you to hosting a podcast like this, giving us a little bit of a spotlight, but it's hard to get out there.
Yeah, well, that is one of the reasons that I started the podcast too. I interviewed um, Laura Jenkinson, and I don't know if you're familiar with her. She was the
I'm
host of the
not.
Read It with Whiskey podcast,
Okay.
and she ended her podcast. She was doing the same thing, interviewing sci-fi and fantasy authors. And when that ended, I thought, well, there really needs to be this space for independent authors to be able to share
Yeah.
their work. So that's really the whole motivation behind this was letting people like you get your book in front of people.
And with
So
no time at all, you became the greatest podcast in the multiverse.
it happened literally overnight.
We need to get you a
Yes.
trophy or something for the background.
That'd be fantastic.
Yeah.
I'd love that. So let's talk about you a little bit more. You have two books out. They've both been released fairly recently. When did you start writing, and how did you get to the point of publishing your first book?
I mean, so it depends on what you're asking. If you're asking novels, not too long ago, I got started writing in like 2019. Um, but I had been writing for a long time. I started off writing poetry.
Okay.
And I had written poetry pretty much all throughout college, off and on. I got really into it during grad school, and then after grad school, I moved down to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and I got involved in the poetry community down there. Got
Okay.
really active in doing like poetry slams, and I was on their national poetry slam team. I got to go to
Awesome.
the national poetry slam finals, or not finals, the national poetry slam competition in Oakland one year to compete. And so that was just a really cool way to get find a writing community, and I really love poetry.
Yeah.
But I love reading some poetry. And I have to be in a good mood to really want to sit down and consume a book of poetry. But I've always gravitated towards reading fantasy for just enjoyment. And so when I was writing, I was like, there's this faraway idea of wanting to write a fantasy book someday. But it was something I hadn't really considered as a reality for a while. And then I decided to give it a try. I wasn't really in a competitive space with like poetry slam or anything anymore, and um, I wanted to keep on writing and find like a new goal for myself, and so I started trying out some fiction, and you know, my first draft of No Heart for a Thief was the messiest thing. I mean, head hopping from one character to another
Mm.
every other sentence. It, you know, it nothing was consistent. The book had so many plot holes. It was just, you know, it it was a whack-a-mole of plot holes kind of thing. Um, and so, but I loved doing it. And so I think that was the saving grace of, I loved writing it. But not only I loved writing it, I loved editing it. So I know there will be a lot of authors who will be like, I hate editing, or I hate the first draft, or I love every process of putting a book together.
That's
I
awesome.
think the one thing I don't like is like the logistics of getting it put on a platform, and like making sure you got all your I's dotted and your T's crossed and
Right.
everything's ready to go. But
Yep.
and as far as like writing the book, I love it all, and
That's
so
great.
it just kind of kept me going.
Yeah, that is rare, because you do, well, maybe it's not rare, but you often hear authors talking about how they hate some part of the process in there. They love the drafting, but they hate the editing. Or I know some authors who love the editing and aren't as big on the drafting. They want to kind of fine tune it once it's ready. But
Yeah,
um, you know, it's a long process, both sides of it. So
it is.
especially when you're writing a fantasy novel that's 500-600 pages, that's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of time on both ends. So
Yeah,
how
it's
did you go? Oh, sorry.
no. I was just gonna agree with you. It's a lot of time. I think Noah for a Thief went through 10 or 11 just edits and rewrites and all that kind of stuff until it no longer looked like the Frankenstein monster it was.
Right. So was that how you got your manuscript from the super rough draft that it was to what it ended up being? Was it just a lot of editing? Did you go through a developmental editing process to kind of find those rough spots?
No, actually, I just kind of dug into it. I tried out some critique partners. I didn't really have a whole lot of good experiences with critique partners and things like that, but I was able to get my hands in some people, my novels in some people's hands. And I got some feedback and I tried to work on that. And then I got some more feedback and I tried to work on that. And it was just, it was this process of learning by doing. I am unfortunately, I can be a very stubborn person at times. And so, just like the banging my head against the rock of the novel actually taught me how to do some things. And so, it was a good learning experience, but it was also a process of reading a lot. And so, at one point, I was reading the Farseer trilogy while I was early on in editing, and so everything I started to edit started to sound like a bad version of Robin Hobb, um, and so everything just kind of absorbed into the process until I found out how I wanted to sound on the page.
Hmm.
And even till one of the last drafts, I had taken some bad writing advice about how everything needs to be very clean and crisp, and how all these every sentence needs to like try to serve a specific point, and how you need to get rid of all these kinds of words and keep these kinds of words. And it ended up being this really choppy, robotic kind of thing where the story was there, but the writing just it felt like it didn't exist as a part of the story. It was just functional.
Right.
And so at some point, I finally was like, that's not what I want to write. And I decided to bring a lot more of like the poetry that I love back into it, and trying to write in a lyrical and a, a cadence that really feels like it fits my voice.
Mm.
And so when I think I found how to do that, it really it hit a groove.
I love that. And often you hear people talk about author voice, and they don't really describe what that means. Um,
Yeah,
but I think in saying that you went through the process, and especially knowing your background in poetry, that you wanted to make sure it kind of had the flow that your poetry did and that inspiration behind it.
yeah,
I think that's great that you were able to look at that choppy edited manuscript and see that it wasn't your voice, and that it didn't reflect what you wanted to put on the page.
yeah. And that might have worked for some people really, really well, but it didn't
Yeah.
work for me and the story that I wanted to tell. I'm a firm believer that an author is always their first audience. and I need to tell a story that I'm interested in hearing. And that's why I wrote No Heart for a Thief. That's why I'm interested in the stories that I tell, is because they're stories that I want to read.
Of
And
course.
so if I'm not writing in a style that I'm interested in, then I I don't think it's authentic. I think it probably shows up on the page that it doesn't feel authentic.
Right.
And so I just decided to write the kind of prose that I wanted to write, and I hope it shows up on the page in terms of that care and that authenticity.
For sure. So, what is the why behind your process? You talked a bit about how you had an interest in poetry before. What's the why in your writing? Why storytelling? Why did you decide to put the novel into words?
And I think I could answer that question in probably 1,000 different ways and not lie a single time. Um, and part of it is I love storytelling. I love writing. I love reading story. I love stories in general. I, I love watching a good movie or seeing a good show. I love just immersing myself in a world. And so there's that act of immersion that is a big part of writing for me. That is definitely a big part of that why. Um, and then I think there's also an act of wanting to say something. I think that some people will write a book and or go looking for books that they feel are escapist, and that's great. That's great for some people. I'm not interested in escaping in the same way. I'm interested in tackling uh, issues that I feel powerful, that I feel strongly about in in a fantasy setting. I think that fantasy offers you the ability to disconnect from some of the baggage of this world and then address some of the issues that we have such a hard time talking about. And so that's part of the why is I want to talk about that. I mean, that's a lot of what science fiction is as well, right? I mean, you're using a
Definitely.
platform of technology and this thoughtfulness of the future or whatever you may be doing to be talking about a social issue. I think that's when
Yeah.
science fiction and fantasy are the most interesting to me. Um,
Yeah.
so I think there are a lot of different whys, and I could probably ramble on for an hour, but you don't want to hear that, so we can
That's
skip
fine.
that lecture.
Well, I mean, it could be interesting, but I mean, you do raise a very good point, and I think at the heart, science fiction and fantasy has always been that way. Talking about, and that is what makes it interesting, is because you can talk about real world issues in a fantastical way, in a
Yeah,
way that brings new light and new magic to it. Um, so, definitely.
yeah.
So how about more specifically, I guess then to when you start to put the story on the page, what does your process look like? Do you start with the world? Are you starting with that central theme? How does it all come together for you?
I think you're assuming an intentionality that I might not have. Um, I think that in 10 years, I will be able to answer that question a lot better. For this first book, for this first world, it started with me walking my dog and just thinking about things. And for some reason, I kind of latched onto this idea of sin eaters. I like the idea of this being that can literally consume the sin of another person. It's a very cool idea to me. And so from that, I thought, like, what about consuming magic? What would that look like? And that is where the magic system of No Heart for a Thief kind of that was the genesis of its idea. And
Cool.
then I just was, walking around not working on any writing and playing in my head for the longest and taking notes on my phone at 3 a.m. when I woke up with an idea that didn't make sense in the morning. But just that that seed germinated into a lot of different paths in my mind. So I
Hmm.
don't know if that's a good process, but um, I think that has been where I've kind of tried to build my ideas from. There are definitely other series and other stories I want to develop, and a lot of it comes from just a singular idea that I think would look cool in a world, or a singular idea of a character that I think, okay, how would they fit into a space? And then I try to build out everything as a consequence from that, because and that's part of what I also love about world building, is when you feel like everything naturally is a consequence of each other, like that interconnectivity of a world is so important for that immersion, because you're like,
Mhm.
oh, that makes sense because of this and this and this and this, and it becomes that kind of obsessive process of just trying to think your way through a world. I remember rocking my son to bed when he was like 6 months old, and I'd be sitting there just rocking, and he didn't fall asleep for anything. And so I'd be there
Oh,
for an hour, hour and a half, just rocking back and forth, and at the whole time just playing in my head about how this magic system affected that, or how this belief in a spirit, or this belief in a religious system, or that affected the world. And it just became a lot of, playing ping pong with myself, bouncing ideas back and forth.
right. Cool. I don't think that that's that unusual of a process of
Yeah.
developing a fantasy world where you come up with an idea that is what if this, and it
Hmm.
could be something really specific, and then things build on top of that. I know I've had stories that build that definitely build that way, where it's like one idea, and
Yeah.
now you have a series out of that one
Yeah.
idea, right? Um, and that's I think a lot of the time that's how that process works.
Yeah. I hope I can be a little bit more strategic in the future, but we'll see. Maybe I'll just have to wait on those one ideas to come off, and I can build on that.
Yeah, it's funny how once that process starts, you don't ever seem to run out of ideas. You just don't
Yeah.
have the time to put them down onto paper.
No,
That's
I
how I
definitely
find
have a
anyway.
file of like just badly sketched out ideas on my computer.
Yeah, I think that is a prerequisite of being an author.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, what other authors have inspired you?
I don't know if I have time to list them all. Specifically with No Heart for a Thief, I think one clear and big inspiration is Patrick Rothfuss. I loved The Name of the Wind when it came out. Um, I'm still a fan of the book. I think there are issues with the book that have been pointed out, but um, the I think being interested in poetry and being interested in fantasy and reading The Name of the Wind made me feel like there was a world in which those two things could live together in very cool harmony. And so Name of the Wind was definitely an inspiration for my story. I mean, it operates in a similar framing device. You have a story within a story, and No Heart for a Thief operates in that same framing device.
Mm,
Different stories, you know, pretty completely, um,
right.
but they share that fundamental DNA. Um,
Cool.
Robin Hobb, I love her character work, and um, we probably share something in common in terms of torturing our main characters a little too much. So Fitz goes through quite a hell, and so does Kalo. Um, I I would also say N.K. Jemisin. Uh, the fifth season is one of my, if not my favorite book. Um, I think the things that she does with
Cool.
prose in order to tell a story is so amazing in that book.
Mm,
I Oddly enough, I would say Juno Diaz. So if you're not familiar, literary fiction, um, wrote The Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, a highly award-winning book.
okay.
Just kind of about he has a trilogy of books that are really just about his experience as a Dominican immigrant. But he treats the Dominican Republic as if it's a fantasy world building exercise, because he develops the lore of it, the history. That
Hmm.
so it in I actually, at the beginning of writing No Heart for a Thief, I had footnotes like he has in his book, A Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, where it's very voicey footnotes where the author's kind of tongue in cheek and sarcastic about these history
Okay.
footnotes. And I tried to do that in my book. So I tried to emulate a lot of things before I figured out what would work in this story.
Right.
Uh, but those books definitely have been an inspiration. Um, you know, I don't know if I don't know if I can remember everything else that's kind of fit in there, but I
No.
think I can take anything. I take a little bit from everything that I read.
Right. Yeah, and that's fair enough too. You know, you have obviously there's a couple of big influences, and then everything else you kind of read along the way feeds into something in the narrative one way or another.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your books. We've kind of talked a little bit briefly about them, but tell us about No Heart for a Thief
Yeah,
and a little bit about No Safe Haven if it doesn't get too far into spoiler territory.
yeah. I would say that No Heart for a Thief and No Safe Haven, they're the first two parts of Malitu. And this story it's really a continuous story. There are some hard stop points at the end of each of the books, but it's this overarching narrative um, in which you have the land of Ania. It has been uh, conquered and colonized by a foreign power, and you have Kalo, who you first meet as this jaded rebel who's kind of failed, and he is kind of hiding out in the middle of nowhere from the consequences of the past, and just um, really down on himself and just kind of ready to live out the rest of his days in obscurity. When he comes upon Tayan, who's being attacked by two Imperial soldiers, and Tayan's this young girl who reminds him of his people and who he hasn't connected with in a long time. And against his better judgment, he gets involved. And he knows every time he gets involved, things end up getting fucked up down the line. And but he gets involved and ends up saving this girl who has just lost everything that's dear to her, lost her family, doesn't know what to do with herself, and so finds herself kind of uh, only understanding one thing, and that's that she thinks she needs to get vengeance for her family. Um, and Kalo tries to stop her from going down that path because he's been down that path. And so he tries to tell her the story of his life to convince her that this is just a bad idea. So you have this kind of juxtaposition of two coming of age stories. You have Tayan's in the future with Kalo as he's training her and trying to figure out what life looks like not on his own anymore, and Tayan trying to figure out what life is like without her family, but with this new stranger in her life. And then you have this past story of Kalo literally telling his story of how he became the person he is today. And you have some things that definitely run parallel in their stories and they play off each other. And so it's really this idea of, you know, how do those people who don't have a say over the major political decisions in their lives react when the powers that be have just turned their world upside down, taken their culture from them, and done these horrible things?
Hmm.
How do these average people find themselves and learn what it is to be themselves when so much of themselves is being destroyed in an act of genocide? And so it's a lot of that self discovery just in this really high fantasy world with magic and all of
Wow. Cool.
that.
How difficult was it to get those different storylines to kind of meld?
Um, I don't think it was all that difficult actually.
Okay.
It to me it because I like to write with a cadence. I think there's a certain cadence to the storylines as well.
Hmm.
Um, I didn't write. write like, well, here's the present storyline, and then I'll write the past storyline later. I just wrote it all in one as the book flows. That's how I wrote
Okay.
it,
Okay.
because I think that helped me figure out, well, this is what we found out in the past, and this is how it impacts the future. And because he's telling this thing about the future, and this is what's happening in the future, let's mirror that here with this action here in the past. And so by just writing it in that line, I was able to kind of bounce back and forth. And so I will say there's a little bit of difference from the Name of the Wind there, where you don't have a whole lot of action in that framing device. You have a little bit in terms of some interlude scenes, but
Mhm.
there's not much movement and development in that framing device. Whereas I'm trying to tell two stories at the same time, and both have arc. The present story just definitely has a longer arc, trying to tell that relationship between Halo and Taein. Um, but yeah, I don't know. Hopefully I did it well. Hopefully it makes some sense. In my mind, it worked out pretty well.
For
Yeah.
sure. And so, No Safe Haven, does it follow a similar framework?
It Yes. So all three books are going to follow a similar framework of a story within a story.
Okay.
There are certain arcs within his past and Kayla's past that kind of show up and affect the present in terms of Taeyen's understanding of the present. And so that's how No Safe Haven works as well. It would be completely spoilery to talk too much about No Safe Haven.
Yeah.
It's safe to say, like, it starts pretty much exactly where No Heart for a Thief ends, right after some major reveals, and so you get to kind of follow that storyline. I think um, if you read No Heart for a Thief and thought, well, there are some dark things in this, you're gonna read No Safe Haven and go, oh, it this is darker. Um,
Okay.
my wife read it, or she hasn't even finished No Safe Haven yet, but looked at me and was like, you wrote, why did you write this? Like, this is very dark. Who am I
Yeah.
sleeping next to? So, um, I wouldn't call it grimdark, but there are definitely some ugly things that happen.
Okay. That is a really good place to pivot our conversation just a little bit and talk about dark fantasy. So, what is dark fantasy, and how does it different from just fantasy or from horror?
So I'm gonna kind of throw this question through a little bit of a loop because I don't think in a straight line. um,
That's fine.
but I think dark fantasy is one thing if you read it in terms of how it's defined uh, by the powers that be. Dark fantasy is fantasy with horror elements. No Heart for a Thief is not that.
Okay.
Um, it's the problem with genre, right? Because
Yeah.
genre is a language for us to talk about books to understand one another. And most people who use the term dark fantasy are not talking about horror elements. They're talking about this spectrum between epic fantasy that's kind of has more light elements and has this heroic arc, uh, to grimdark, which is very gritty and has just this rough, tumultuous world and extremely morally gray characters on every end of the scale. Um, and so when people say dark, they're like, well, it's not grim dark, but it's dark. And so they're
Mhm.
really just talking about some brutal elements, maybe some gore, some violence, um, and they're really referring to kind of the tone. And
Okay.
so I've never called No Heart for a Thief dark fantasy because I'm aware that it doesn't have horror elements. That's not the genre it fits. What I'll say is it's a dark coming of age fantasy,
Okay.
more so referring to like it's a tone difference. Like it is a coming of age story and it's in fantasy, but it's a dark one. It's not going to be your YA book.
Okay.
Um, Although I have in the same week I did get a review that called it YA and another review that called it grim dark. And so I think that just goes to show you how little we all agree on what means what genre.
Yeah.
So people
Okay.
will identify my book as grimdark once in a while.
Right.
Others will. say it's YA because it follows a young protagonist.
Hmm.
Um, so it's I think that's the difficulty with genre. We're trying to talk
Yeah,
about conventions, and sometimes books don't fall neatly into conventions.
absolutely. Yeah. And I think, like you said, there definitely is a spectrum there.
Yeah.
And sometimes trying to categorize different books within that spectrum is a difficult thing to do.
And grimdark is a pretty new genre, right? Like it
Yes.
hasn't been around long enough for people to really understand what is meant by grimdark.
Hmm.
Grimdark authors themselves will argue and disagree with what that genre means. And so I think it just needs time before we understand what we mean by grimdark. Um, and then we might be able to have some more language about that spectrum that makes sense. But
Yeah.
it's hard because we have words that cross over a lot, like dark meaning five different things.
Hmm. So, how would you categorize, I guess, then? Because you're saying there are dark elements in your story, but not
Hmm.
horror elements. How
Yeah.
do you distinguish those two, and how did you not cross over that line, or do you think maybe there just isn't a definite line that you decided or not decided to
Hmm.
cross over, but kind of how did you straddle that?
I mean, again, I don't think the intentionality was there. Like my goal was not to write into a genre. My goal was to write the story and then tried to figure out what the genre was afterwards, which I don't think
Okay.
is an easy task.
No.
Um, I if you speak to any authors, they're always like, I hated writing the synopsis, I hated writing the blurb. Anything shorter than my 125,000 words for book one, I hated writing because now you're asking me to pick and choose.
Hmm.
Um, so, yeah, I don't think there was an intentionality there. Um, and it's all kind of based on taste preference, what counts as dark. Um, I never wanted to write a grimdark story, I will say that, because I wasn't looking to write and one thing that I think grimdark is nihilistic about the opportunity for hope and growth.
Mm.
And there's a point to that there, and there's a reason why that's there. But I think that hope is a central part of my story. But I think the dark elements are there to make sure that that hope remains a central part because there's that conflict there. Um, whereas you're talking about um, making sure that it doesn't fall into dark fantasy in terms of horror aspects. When I think of dark fantasy genre conventions, it's including traditionally horror aspects. So, including werewolves or vampires or that kind of brand of monsters,
Right.
including ghosts and spectral images and things like that. Uh, there are spirits, so I don't know if that lingers into that a little bit. We'll see. I think it probably depends on the reader, but those those conventions of horror just finding themselves in a fantasy lens, I think, is what makes something a dark fantasy.
Interesting. That's a good perspective. And I liked what you were talking about with the characterization of hope in a story as well, because I do feel, from at least from my experience, that is kind of one of those defining aspects of if it goes into the grim dark territory or not, is if there is hope, because in grimdark there is not. Um, so that is kind of a good way to think about that. And then with the monster piece as well, I to be honest, have not read a lot of dark fantasy, so this is a lot of new things for me too. So I didn't realize that that was a major trope for dark fantasy.
Yeah, at least as I've read about what dark fantasy is.
Okay.
And I think it's a chicken or the egg thing, really, because I never started using the word dark in terms of describing my work until people started adding it into reviews.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it was an act of trying to speak the same language as my readers were speaking,
Right.
because every review that came out initially was going like, this is a great dark fantasy. I'm like, I don't think it fits dark fantasies, but I
Mm.
want to communicate with my readers with the words that they're using. And so that's where my use of the word dark coming of age came from.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's great from a marketing perspective to kind of fit the language that the readers that are enjoying your book are using to kind of match that. So, um, So what kind of tropes or what tropes do you have in the series then, other than coming of age, which you've mentioned? What other tropes can readers expect?
So there's definitely a mentor and mentee trope, or a teacher and student trope. I've always loved that trope. I love that dynamic, and so that is definitely at play here. Um, there is what other tropes? And there are far too many to name them all. I mean, the story
Mhm.
within the story convention is a big trope. Um, the And this is something that some readers don't necessarily enjoy about my book, but I lean into this trope. There is within it the evil empire trope. Now,
Mhm.
I wouldn't necessarily say like they're the dark evil empire of the world kind of thing, but I'm not spending time in my book exploring the rationale and the reasons behind their actions. And that
Okay.
is done with specific purpose because uh, this is essentially about those people that are subject to the decisions of this empire.
Hmm.
So they don't care about the whys. They
Yeah.
only care about what's actually happening. And so I don't want to spend time focusing on the whys of those people who are doing the colonizing. And so some people were like, I want a more fleshed out villain. This is not about the villain. And so that's another thing you'll find. Like it's a very intimate book. As much as it has some scale to it, it is a very intimate book focusing on a handful of characters, and it doesn't necessarily mind itself on the intentions of other people around in the world, just the consequences of those actions.
Right. Okay. So, well, let's talk a little bit about the world that the characters find themselves in. I
Mhm.
mean, obviously, you just talked a little bit about the empire that they don't care about the motivations are, but what is the world that you've put
Yeah.
your characters into?
So Ania is a land of spirits. So the people of Ania have lived in relative peace for quite a long time. They have a history of war in their past, but have found some balance between themselves, which has perfectly set them up for this empire that has come in and taken advantage of that peace. Um, and when I say it's a land of spirits, there's two planes in this world. There's a spiritual plane known as the mist, and there's a physical plane known as the waking. And there are dancers within this world who hear aspects of the spiritual plane sifting through into the waking. They can hear the call of certain spirits and be able to dance with that, what they call the song, and manipulate the world in different aspects. So there's a elemental magic system kind of going on at play where these dancers can manipulate it. And then you have the seventh great spirit, which has become known as the thief colloquially by the people of Ania, um, because she gives her followers, her descendants, the ability to steal other people's magics, to steal those magics from other dancers. Um, and so a lot of internal stories that are cultural have been built up around basically labeling this spirit as evil and all of her descendants as evil. And so there's a feeling of, not only a feeling, but a literal outcast nature to anybody who's touched by the spirit, the spirit thief. And so Kalo ends up figuring out that he is a spirit thief, and that is one aspect of his story as well. But in terms of the world that really kind of builds itself into, stories are a really big part of Aenean culture. They tell and share their story through passing down these parables of what has come before, and so that's a lot of how they learn of each other. Um, and culturally, they're losing that because the Gauch Empire, this colonialist empire, has come in and they found a way to steal the magics permanently from the people of Ania. They have worked to destroy cultural relevant books and tomes and artifacts from this world, and they are just seeking to colonize and assimilate these people while using them for different kinds of slave labor and using them to take these spirits and utilize those powers for their own means. Um, so you'll find, I find, depending on where the reader is from, they'll compare it to a different colonialist regime of their home country.
Mm,
So it's the British in several different continents and countries. It's Americans in other continents and
right.
countries. It's a lot of different colonialist regimes kind of get reflected in these actions because they are universally something that has happened through these colonialist regimes. This idea
Yeah.
of trying to re-educate a populace, this idea of trying to uh, steal and take credit for the works of a populace, to utilize their labor and boost their own personal strength through that consumption. And so
Mm,
there's a lot of that going on. And at this point, I'm just rambling, so I'm gonna kind of
it's
pause it there.
okay.
But there's a lot of different things going on in the world, and it is reflective of our world in some ways, and in other ways, it's completely not.
For sure. I mean, you have developed this really, I don't want to say complex, but this really detailed and refined world with all these aspects going on. How much of your world did you create ahead of time, and how much of it was organic to the story as you were writing?
Um, I don't know anymore. um,
Okay.
I would say there was a good deal of it that I created before time, just making notes before I wrote anything on the paper. Um, but so much of it has been changed from whatever seed was there first.
Yeah.
Um, the the spirit thief was there originally, but that's another thing in this story. You'll meet some of the spirits and get to understand their stories as well to a certain extent. And so at first, the thief had no story. The thief was just a cool way for me to play with this idea of stealing magic.
Mm,
Um, but as I got more into it, I started to develop this lore and this idea of who the thief was. Why would the thief exist in the first place as a character? And so that becomes a big part of the story of like, why why would any spirit exist that could just steal other people's magic? And so there's an aspect to the lore that kind of develops that, and there's aspects of who the spirits are, and you get to kind of understand the spirits almost as people themselves, because they're not um, without emotion. They're not kind of aimless. They have objectives. They have thoughts and feelings about the world. They interact with the world for much longer than any of us do, and so they uh, get to or have to experience a lot of what we go through.
I love how passionate you are about the world you've created, and I love, I love how fired up you get about it, because you've obviously spent a lot of time in this world, putting the story together, and that the aspects that you love about it really come through when you're talking about it, which is fantastic.
Yeah, and you got to nerd out about your own book, if nothing else. Like I, I
Yeah,
I can't force anybody else to do it, so I got to do it.
that's great. Well, I mean, you I think pass on that enthusiasm to your readers, so I think that is great. Let's talk about your characters a little bit. Who are some of your favorite characters and what makes them special?
So I mean, Caleb will always have a special place in my heart because um, I've lived with him the longest, and certain ideas and thoughts and feelings I've experienced in my own life, I've definitely imbued into his experience. And so there's definitely some aspects of me. I think in any one of our characters, we probably imbue parts of ourselves. And so there are definitely living pieces of myself within Kalo. Not that I've been through anything nearly what he's been through, but uh, I think there will always be a part of me that loves that character. Um,
Cool.
I think the most fun character I find in both No Heart for a Thief and No Safe Haven would probably be between three characters: Nyx and Wall from No Heart for a Thief that also appear in No Safe Haven. Nyx is this very small character in book one. It really only shows up towards the middle end of the book and doesn't have much page time. Um, but she is this character who serves as this like the lead of the city guard for this city of refugees that is just trying to keep themselves alive during wartime. Um, and she has a very dry sense of humor, is very combative, but has, kind of that old trope of like heart on the outside, had a heart of gold,
Yeah.
but even that heart of gold is really dry and like combative. I think of her as kind of like the Roy Kent of my universe. If you are familiar with Ted Lasso, um, and then you have Wall, who I guess I'm attracted to my sarcastic characters because Wall is a character who is really sarcastic and I think it's his defense mechanism for trying to figure out this world that he finds himself in as a kid, just trying to survive, and so he gets a tongue that's much too quick for his own good.
Mm.
Um, but he's a lot of fun, and he becomes extremely complicated in No Safe Haven. I think
Okay.
his character arc is one of my favorite to write because he gets
Mm.
so complicated as we move forward.
Okay.
And then the third is specifically in No Safe Haven. There's a character named Lonigan, who is, I guess we all have our self inserts in different ways as a poet.
Mm.
And I have you read Farseer trilogy?
I haven't.
So there's a character named the Fool, who's kind of this really wise, but as his name would describe, uh, maligned as a fool, maligned as like not really understanding, but has this secret knowledge,
Okay.
and kind of speaks in riddles and all that kind of stuff. That's also another tropey thing in fantasy. And so I wrote, Lonigan, who's this kind of poet who likes to speak in these uh, really metaphorical phrases and likes to
Mm.
kind of talk his way around the world instead of going to the point. Um, but as you can see, I can talk my way around the world too, and so I like that idea of somebody who can't get to the point, and so just has to talk until they find their way all the way
Mm.
back to it.
Hmm.
And so Lonigan is a really cool character that I love
Cool.
writing.
So, what can readers expect as they read through this series? What kind of emotional impact do you hope that you have on them?
Um, Trauma. um, no, the characters do go through a lot of trauma, but I think they go through growth with that trauma. I don't know. Maybe I'm broken deep down somewhere inside, but um, part of me has a hard time believing things that are just purely good and don't have a little bit of dark undercurrent. And so I've written a book that I think has a lot of dark undercurrent that has a lot of things that the things that happen to these characters are all pretty bad. But the response of these characters is to try to find more humanity, trying to find more connection, trying to connect more with each other. Um, and so I hope that that aspect comes through, that although awful shit is happening in the world, we can still find ways to connect with each other and find ways to be human by overcoming, by not engaging, by pushing through. Um, so I hope that comes through. Um, I think there are some other themes around dealing with colonialism and all of that, and I think that that's an important discussion.
Mm-hmm.
But for some readers, they're not looking for a discussion; they're looking for a story, and so I hope readers who are looking for what they're looking for get what they're looking for. Like I hope those that want to have the intellectual conversation about how analogous this is or isn't to real world colonialism and the effects on the world and all, like people who want to have that discussion. I hope that there's enough in this book for you to chew on. And for those people who are just looking to have this fantasy read, who want to hear about a cool magic system and play around with these characters that are growing and going through challenges and having hardships. I want them to also have that experience. So, I don't believe that an author can ever tell a reader what they're supposed to get out of a book.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't know who said it, but I really liked how they said it. Was at, after I release my book, I am at best a well-informed reader,
Mm.
um, because I have no more control or ownership of this story than anybody else once it's out there.
Yeah.
Because once you buy the book, once you read it, it's your story as well, and it's yours to interpret however you would.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I feel like that's a Neil Gaiman quote, but I could be wrong.
It
Sounds like
it may
something he
be.
would say. Yeah. I really liked what you said about adding the dark elements to the good for your characters, because I think that's what creates deep characters and complex
Mhm.
characters, is having them respond to those situations and to them trying to sort out where the hope is in the stark world that they live in.
Yeah,
So, what can readers expect from you next? You've got book 2 coming out, but is
yeah.
book 3 in the works?
So book three is in the works. I'm 90% sure that I'm going to be able to release it by the end of 2024. So I'm hoping to have this first trilogy done by the end of next year. Um, it was easier with book two because I had written my first draft before I even published my first No Heart for a Thief book. So it was
Mm.
a little bit easier to kind of get that pacing out. Um, but yeah, no safe havens out October 24th, and then within a year and maybe a couple of months that book three will be out, which is Only a Grave Will Do. Um, my once you read No Heart for a Thief, uh, you'll see why the titles are how they are. It reflects a phrase in the world. So there's that connection point.
Yeah.
But after that, um, there are two stories that I'm really playing with in my head, and I'm not sure which one to do. It probably will depend on the reception of this first trilogy, because one is an offshoot trilogy in the same world, but with different characters,
Okay.
exploring a whole different aspect of that world. And I really like some of the ideas and the themes that can be played with in that story. So I'm definitely kind of generating ideas about that. And the other one is a completely different world, um, that is inspired by Arcane, the television
Awesome.
show.
Yeah.
I I just love that show so much.
It is
And
such
I
a
just
good show.
saw the second season is coming out. They said winter of 2024. So I don't know if that
Right.
means January to March or next December.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, I don't know
because
either.
they made that so ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
But I really love that show. I love, and it's not necessarily plot line similar, but it
Okay.
is kind of world and tonally similar.
Mm-hmm.
Dark, gritty world, but this kind of caste system going on. This play between like what is kind of scientifically arcane versus what is kind of magical going on. Just
Right.
some fun themes to play with. And I've
Cool.
generated some part of a story for at least book one. And so I don't know what I'm going to do next. Uh, I might do something like I see some of the other authors like Rob J. Hayes will bounce between series doing one book and then another book. So I might
Yeah.
do something like that.
Okay.
But we'll see.
Yeah. I've contemplated doing that as well, but it takes me, well, it feels like it takes me a long time to get a book written. So
Yeah.
I think, how long is it going to take me to bounce between books? But that's okay.
The hope
You
is
know,
we get better at doing it as we go forward, right?
that's right. That is correct. So this is the greatest podcast in the multiverse. So can you tell me about how in a parallel universe, a different choice may have shaped another version of your life?
So this was an interesting question. And I've actually thought about this before. When I was in fifth grade, and I got this assignment from my teacher where he printed off a bunch of these images that were just black and white pictures and handed them out, and our assignment was to write a story about whatever was on the page. And I got some kind of like space troop. They were like in this like far out world and had like the typical spacesuits and guns and all of that. And I wrote a little story, and then I wrote another little story, and then I wrote another little story, and I showed them to him, and I was like, "This is really cool," and I got really excited about it. But nobody else got really excited about it, and so I just kind
Mm,
of like put it aside. And then later on in another year we had to compile this like book of different types of poetry, um, and I got really excited about doing different things in different genres of poetry and uh, different I'm missing the word right now, but basically different frameworks of poetry structure.
yeah,
um, and like I got really excited about that, but also nobody got really excited about it around me. And so I sadly was too focused on other people kind of defining what was possible for me at that time in my
yeah,
life.
hmm
And so I wonder what would have happened if I had recognized writing as something that I loved to do earlier on in my life. Because I didn't go to college I went to college for math, um, which I love doing to a certain extent, but it's nowhere near as enjoyable for me as writing. Um,
right,
Now I may be really hard up with my creative MFA and living from paycheck to paycheck in a horrible way. But it would be interesting to see what that person would have done with writing and what kind of stories that person would have been able to create by this time in my life. Um,
right,
because I released my first fantasy book at 35,
yeah,
and it's not extremely old, but it's not young.
no,
And so I'm wondering what that kid who was, what's fifth grade, like 10 years
it's
old,
like 8 years old, 10 years old, yeah,
yeah,
something like that.
something like
Hmm
that. What would that kid have been able to do if instead of putting aside those stories, kept on trying to write like shitty stories at first, just allowing myself to create things and do
Right.
all of that, and I invest in that as a skill? Who would that kid have become?
Yeah, I I relate to that because I didn't necessarily have the exact same experience, but the experience of being told that it wasn't a viable option,
Mm-hmm.
this writing thing. And I mean, I was 38 when I published my first book, so I mean, yeah, what would thing how would things have looked if I had done that
Yeah.
15 years earlier, right? So I mean, self-publishing wasn't as um, defined, that 15 years ago. But
Yeah.
at the same time, I mean, I could have been pitching agents. I could have been going through a different route of some sort, and who knows what an extra 15 years of novel writing might have might have looked like. So
Or we might
I
have
hear
written
you there.
shittier books, you
It's
know,
possible too.
because that life experience also adds something to what you're able to put out. I may have not
Yeah.
spent as much time on poetry as I did, um, and that would have affected how I was able to craft my writing. But I do think about, what if I had followed something less practical and more interesting to me,
hmm
and what
hmm
that would have looked like for my skill level, my craft level, my enjoyment of life.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's very, very true words,
Yeah.
James. Thank you so much for joining me. Can you tell our listeners where they can find you?
Of course. Find me on probably most active social media wise on Twitter, but I'm on Twitter, uh, Blue Sky, I think that's what it's called. I just got on there. I'm on Threads to a certain extent, and TikTok. I'll go on there once in a while. You can find me there. I think I'm James L. Dulin on most platforms, so you can find me that way. JamesLDulin.com is my website. You can find my ebook is exclusively on sale on Amazon, but my physical books are on sale pretty much anywhere you can buy your books. So Barnes and Noble, Bookshop.org. Um, I think we'll be doing another run of 50 signed and numbered copies with a broken binding soon. Um, uh, and don't forget Silverstone Books. I think it's .com. They're an amazing indie bookseller.
Yeah.
So they have some of my books as well. But yeah, you can just Google me if you ever have a hard time searching, I guess. No Heart for a Thief is kind of a one, I like the title in general, but two, it's a good title because I I've never seen another book called that. Whereas No Safe
Right.
Haven, it blends in a little bit more to other books. So just looking up No Heart for a Thief, you'll find me pretty easily.
Awesome. Thank you once again for joining me, James. This has been a blast, and
Yeah,
I hope to talk to you soon.
yeah, likewise.
Thank you for joining me. If you enjoyed the show, like and subscribe on your favorite podcast app or on YouTube. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Greatest Podcast in the Multiverse. As well, you can help support the show by supporting me on Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, you can get early access to the show, as well as submit your questions for my upcoming guests. I hope to see you next time. Bye now.